What do you say, Vilnius? Are you ready for this? Yeah, a couple people are. Cool. Let me start off. How many of you, sorry, camera dude, how many of you currently work for a startup or have worked for startups in the past? Oh, right on. Nice. Cool. So those of you who are doing startups are going to get some cool info of things I've learned over the years. Those of you who haven't, I'm going to give you some advice and give you some tips that will help make your startup successful. Before I do, though, on the left-hand side of all of my slides, I've got slido.com with hashtag DevOps 2019. Post all your questions there. At the end of that, we'll go through the questions. And then the ones we don't get to here, I'll be over in the Ask Me Anything corner. And if you want, you can hit me up on Twitter after the conference or anything that you want to take offline, whatever works best for you. So the great part about working for a startup is you get this blank slate environment. You get a chance to build the thing that you always thought was possible without any limitations, and you don't have to try to figure out how to make it work with all of your legacy systems, right? The downside is that no one knows what the hell they're doing, right? It's not just you, it's everyone in the company. And then, so when someone figures out, hey, we should be doing this, you have to switch priorities and drop whatever you're doing and go pursue that thing. And so that means that, sometimes things don't get completed. So if you're the kind of person that just can't leave a project halfway done, startups may not be the right place for you. And then I think a lot of people have heard that startups have anywhere from a 60 to 90% failure rate, depending on, where you get your data from. And so that's easy to wrap your head around. The part that it's really important to me to stress is that when we say startup failure rate, that means not only the company fails, but that means you lose your job too. And when you lose your job, you lose your paycheck. So there's a lot of personal implications to that statement of the failure rate. And DevOps in the startup world is a little bit different than DevOps for traditional mature businesses, in the fact that your efforts are tightly coupled with the marketing efforts, the growth of the company, and the available capital. So I want you to think back to the time that you made a large purchase in the past, like say buying an automobile. Well, when you decided to buy that car, you didn't just go down to the dealership, jump in the car, and drive away. I mean, you can do that, but that's called Grand Theft Auto, and there's better ways of handling that, right? So you determined what your budget was, first of all, and then maybe you had to save up some money for a down payment to get a good interest rate on the car. And then you had to figure out, the extra costs associated with owning that car, such as registration fees, insurance, maintenance costs, things like that. Well, a startup's very much like that. Startups get their money either from being bootstrapped or funded. So by bootstrapped, I mean that the founders of the company are financing the startup efforts through their own personal money. And then funded is funding from venture capital, which is initially it's called like a seed round of funding, where an investor will give you your initial seed round of cash. And so from the DevOps perspective, your actions have to align with those financial objectives of the company. For example, if the company is being bootstrapped and you launch a global network of M5 X-large servers around the world in AWS before you even have your first customer, it's not really financially aligned with the company, and odds are you're going to run out of cash before you become a successful startup. So it's a really tricky thing to do, and I'm going to show you in this talk how I work with founders to break startups into 3 distinct phases and the different DevOps tools and principles that work best with each phase. There's a lot of similarities in the startup industry or launching a startup to aviation history. For example, whenever the Wright brothers launched their plane in 1903, they really had no way of foreseeing what modern air travel would look like. But they launched their product, they iterated, they got feedback, they iterated based on the feedback, which ultimately in stage 2 led to what we refer to now as the modern airline industry, the passenger airline industry. They built the product that the customers wanted to buy. And then that ultimately led to stage 3, where your company exits the discovery and the prototype mode, and you shift the focus to running the factory that builds your product. So I want to tell you a little bit about myself, just to help put the talk in context and give you some background info. My first startup was in 1998, and it was crazy. It was wild. It was fun. We were building applications. We were putting content on the internet, which was relatively new at the time. And the company was just growing crazy with new customers and new customers. And it was definitely different than the boring jobs I'd had in the past, or what I now consider boring. I thought, man, it just can't get any better than this. And then, so I get home one day, and I find my wife and my son crying. My son was 1 year old, and he was crying because his mom was crying, because when you're one, that's kind of what you do, right? You see what the other humans are doing, you're like, oh, damn, it's crying time. All right, I got this. So he was crying. My wife was crying, though, because she had gotten a call from the bank who told her that my paycheck had bounced, meaning it had been returned for insufficient funds. And so all of the bills that we had paid, counting on that paycheck, which included our mortgage, our telephone bill, our electric bill, all of those were being returned as well. And if you've ever overdrawn your account at the bank, you know that whenever you overdraw your account, they like to charge you additional money because you didn't have any money, so they're going to charge you more not money that you have, right? And so it just creates this great little cycle there. So I went to work the next morning, talked with the founders. They said, no, it was an accounting error. It was a screw up on our part. We've issued new checks. It's never going to happen again. Don't worry about it. Well, over the next couple months, it happened 2 more times. The final time, my wife was at the checkout line in the grocery store paying for groceries to feed our family, and she couldn't pay for them because our account was overdrawn again. And so she had to, turn around and put all the groceries back and leave the store without any food. So she called me at work, and I decided that, this is enough. We're not going to do this anymore. So I logged into all the servers. I changed all the passwords. I set the services so that they would not start when the server booted. I installed a boot password on all the servers. I powered them all down, and I walked out the door. So after that, I was kind of done with startups for a while. I didn't really work with startups a whole lot. But eventually, the startup bug got back to me. And since then, I've had some startups that have done really, really well. I've had some that have not done well, but none have ever repeated that first scenario. And so that's my goal with this talk today, is if I accomplish nothing else, if I can save any one of y'all from reliving what my first startup experience was like, then I'm going to consider this a successful talk. And with that, let's go into stage 1 of a startup. So stage 1 of a startup is where you're building your minimum viable product, or your MVP. So basically what that is it's a really stripped down, crappy version of what you think your startup ultimately wants to produce. And your job is to get someone to give you money for that product, knowing that it's stripped down, knowing that it's crappy. If you can get someone to give you money for it, that's like proof or validity for your product, that there's a valid market for it. So then let me ask this. How many of you have ever bought something only to be later disappointed because it didn't do what you thought it was going to do? Anyone? Yeah, right? It happens all the time, right? You buy something, you're like, damn it. It's not what it was supposed to do. So that's your job with the MVP, is you sell the MVP, and then you talk with those customers, and you find out what they thought they were buying versus what you actually made, and you close that gap. And then you want to go find more customers just like them. That's your stage 1 of a startup. And so, if you've got DevOps experience here, you've got software engineering experience, you can kind of see that there's not really a lot of room for DevOps here. So let me show you some of the ways you can work with a stage 1 startup based on one of my previous clients. Whenever I started working with them, they had a website, an iOS app, and an Android app. And they were experiencing some growth. They were signing up new customers, starting to do well, starting to get some revenue, but they didn't really know who, because they didn't have their data was being stored in MongoDB, and they didn't really have the skills necessary to query that out. So a buddy of mine called me up and he said, hey, can you just dump this stuff into MySQL so they can write some basic SQL queries and see what's going on with their app? I said, sure. So I built it using Ansible. And the reason I used Ansible, because I was just going to touch this customer one time and then move on. And regardless of what happened after that, anyone who came along behind me could look at the Ansible playbook and see exactly what had been built for them. Well, shortly after that, I figured out that, to be honest, their SQL query skills weren't really that much better than their Mongo query skills. So I ended up creating some automated reports for them that would just do like a weekly cohort analysis of the people who installed the app this week, took these actions versus the people who installed the app last week, and sent that to them via Slack messages. And it just gave them enough information so that they could understand what their marketing efforts were doing on a week-over-week basis. That's about all you can do with a stage 1 startup. But it's helpful, right? It's good for them. So there's this quote from Mark Zuckerberg that move fast and break things, right? Today we're going to sit here and we're going to tear this apart and never do it again. Let me show you what I mean. So we've got a checklist here. Move fast and break things. Are we moving fast? Check. Are we breaking things? Check. Then all's right in the world, right? We're doing what Zuckerberg says. We're destined for success. But is the thing that's broken, has it been broken for 6 months silently in the background, screwing up our data, creating technical debt that nobody knew about, and now we have to go clean that up? Well, check. That's really not the scenario we want, right? So what I like to use is fail fast, and it was taught to me by a guy named Shaker Vamiri. And so the thing about fail fast is it implies a feedback loop, right? The only way you can fail fast is if you're measuring for something to fail. And our goal here is to fail as soon as possible, because in a startup, you've got a fixed amount of time and a fixed amount of money where you have to meet these objectives before you run out of money or it's game over. So if something is failing, we want to know that it's failing as soon as possible. So the difference between move fast and break things and fail fast is with move fast and break things, there's no correlation. We can be moving fast and we can be breaking things, but they're not necessarily related. With fail fast, it forces us to measure our efforts so we know when they fail. So instead of moving fast and breaking things, we want to fail fast in a startup. The other thing, now those of you who said you worked for startups may know this. Those of you who are about to get your first startup experience are going to find out that when you get there, there's probably not any tests. I mean, you might have one test, maybe two, but testing is not really very well utilized in stage 1, and so this is pretty controversial, but I'm going to say that that's okay. And I'm probably the only talk here you're going to hear in this conference where someone actually tells you not to test, right? I mean, that's just dumb. Well, let's take a look. Because our job in the stage 1 is to find out what the customer is trying to buy. And I can tell you that almost every successful startup ends up becoming successful based on a product other than the one they started with. Let me give you some examples to show you what I mean. Maybe you've heard of a website called YouTube. They actually got started as a dating app called what was it? Tune In and Hook Up, right? We'll just move on from that. Netflix, they used to mail you physical DVDs before they launched a streaming service. Groupon was a social media platform that was designed to get people together to help them solve problems. And Yelp was a way for you to ask your friends for recommendations. And so the startup industry is completely filled with different examples of this. You might have some examples in your head right now. I don't know. So back to testing though. What's our stage 1 objective is to find out what the customer is trying to buy. So knowing that, and knowing that if we're successful at all, we're going to be successful most likely with a product other than the one we launched, it means that everything we do in stage 1 will never survive to make it to stage 2. And because of that, it creates a pretty compelling argument to not even bother to write tests with it, because the code's not going to be long-lived, because it's going to be destroyed, and because our job is to find out what we're really supposed to be building as fast as possible. It's a pretty compelling argument, right? That doesn't mean that we skip all best practices, though. We still launch our websites with SSL. We redirect HTTP to HTTPS. We make backups of our data. We protect our infrastructure behind firewalls. We still do all of that kind of stuff. So we're not just like completely careless here. And if all goes successful, your MVP is going to take you into stage 2 of your startup. And now there's no billboard or anything that shows up that says, congratulations, you're in stage 2. But I can give you some signs that indicate you might be getting there. So like an increasing number of customers showing success of your product. That's a good valid indicator. You might have an advanced round of funding, such as a Series A funding. And both of those represent increased financial obligations. So you've got people at this point giving you money with higher expectations of you delivering something back, either in the form of a product or a return on that investment. You may also have increased obligations such as compliance obligations, such as PCI, GDPR, different things like that that you have to contend with. And if you're going to work with startups, I really recommend learning just a little bit about the funding rounds and how funding rounds work, because it gives you a really good indicator of where your company is at and what's expected from you at that time. So these 2 links are really, really short reads that do a great job of explaining the basics of funding rounds. And you'll also have access to all this slide deck at the end, so you can grab the links from there as well. So now we're in stage 2. And we have different priorities, expectations, and definitions of success. So as we set our goals for stage 2, it's important that we set them in accordance with our environment. We're still incredibly young as a company at this point, and working on the wrong thing can have devastating effect or a devastating impact on the company. So we want to set our goals that support the initiatives of the business, right? So goals, they look like in this left-hand column here. And notice that they don't look like the stuff I put in the right column, of tools, technologies, and frameworks. So that doesn't mean that we're not going to specify the tools, technologies, and frameworks in our startup, because otherwise we'll end up supporting everything that exists on the planet, right? We are going to specify them, but they just don't make good goals. And the reason I say that is because no customer in the history of any company has signed up for a product or bought a service because of your sweet, sweet, sweet Docker images, right? No customer ever decided to renew their annual subscription because you have bitchin' Ansible playbooks. Unless that's your actual product, that just doesn't happen. Your customers just don't care. They only care about themselves, and rightly so, because they've given you money to provide that experience. And so our goals should reflect that. So some goals that might align with that are standardizing our CI/CD pipeline for all the teams, automating our infrastructure, because almost none of it is guaranteed to be automated and in stage 1, and then putting in consistent interfaces for monitoring, logging, and alerting. So the reason I like these is because when we enter stage 2, we're probably only going to have a single team in engineering that's just a couple of engineers. But if we do well, whenever we exit stage 2, we're going to have multiple teams in engineering. And in between those 2 points, people are going to shift around between different teams, and we're going to redefine the teams and do a lot of shuffling as we figure out what the right mix for our company is. So knowing that engineers are going to be moving around a lot, whenever engineer Bob goes from team A to team B, he doesn't have to figure out how team B deploys to production. He doesn't have to figure out how to send his application logs to the logging facility. It's all the same. So the only thing that engineer Bob has to figure out is what's unique to the code base of that team that he's moved to. And that allows him to get up to speed quicker, allows him to deliver value quicker, and allows us to deliver value to the customer quicker. So if you've been to any DevOps talks over the past couple of years, you may have heard a lot of talks about culture because it's getting increased recognition. Now at this point in our little startup, we've already started defining culture, whether we realized it or not. Things like how we communicate, whether it's instant message or Slack or face-to-face. How do we do our software development? Is it Agile? Is it Scrum? Are we canoeing down waterfalls? Whatever, it doesn't matter. It's just how we do it. And then we determine how we determine our priorities, whether it comes directly from customer feedback or product owners or top-down driven from our executive team. All of those things are defining our culture. And so some of those things are going to have to change in stage 1 in order for us to be successful in stage 2. So let me show you what I mean by that. In stage 1, a typical engineer is a pretty independent individual. And they have a diverse range of skill sets because at any point they're going to be working on anything. and they're just really known for getting product, out the door. What they may lack, though, is deep expertise in areas such as performance tuning or database design or enterprise-grade architecture. And that's okay because those aren't the skills that we need in stage 1. But if you try to apply that to stage 2 of your startup, where you're increasing the number of engineers, you can see that that's not really a scalable model, right? So we're going to have to change. In stage 1, it might have been okay to, deploy without tests. There may be some places where we don't even have a staging environment, much less whether or not we pushed our code to it. Monitoring and alerting might have been hit or miss, and there'll definitely be some stuff that's not under configuration management. So that was okay in stage 1, but it's not acceptable anymore into stage 2. And so the most important thing to communicate on that is to let everyone know that it's different now. We did that before, we don't do that going forward. So with your engineers who have come through stage 1 with you, it's important to let them know, hey, we used to get away with this, but now that's not how it's done anymore. We're a different company now. We're a more mature company. And then as you hire new engineers in, it's really important to tell them, hey, look, you're going to see some stuff in production. Just because you see it in production doesn't mean it's okay to do, because that's the thing that we had to do to make enough money, to grab enough groundwork, to be able to hire you. But that's not okay going forward. It's really important to communicate that. And communication is going to get harder and harder as your team grows. So, knowing that communication is going to be vital for a company, let's take a couple minutes to talk about how we communicate. There's 2 different thoughts on remote workers, right? There's companies that say, yeah, you can be anywhere in the world, we don't care. And then there's other companies that say, no, we need you in this specific chair between these hours on this day. And it doesn't really matter which, you got to do what's right for your company. I don't care either way. But one thing is true, all companies have remote workers. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Every time you send a Slack message or an email, or you leave a comment on a pull request, you're dealing with remote communication, right? Because you're not speaking face-to-face with that person. So it's really important to understand how remote communication works. So the language barrier can be a barrier for communication, possibly because, I'm here in Lithuania today speaking to you about DevOps in English, right? But even among people who speak the same native language, there can be communication barriers in the fact that, like English in the UK is different than English in the US, which is different than English in Australia. So we're going to have different communication barriers there. So I'm going to grab a drink of water, and I want you to read this sentence for me. So what does that mean? On the surface, it seems pretty straightforward, right? But let me ask you this. Is it possible that someone who was up all night with a sick relative, taking care of them, finally got to sleep, slept through their alarm, was late to work, has a huge project due today, is going to interpret that message differently than someone who slept all night long on a brand new mattress, woke up, had breakfast in the sunshine, and drove to work in their new car listening to their favorite band? It's possible, right? They could interpret that differently. So when you're sending this message, how can you make sure that this message is sent properly, or that the context of that message is sent? Because if I'm sending this, there's obviously something I'm trying to ask here, and if we're talking face-to-face, there's going to be like body language and facial expressions with it. But if I send it remotely, that doesn't exist. So instead, what if I send it with one of these pictures, right? So if you were to receive this with either the top picture or the bottom picture, does that convey a different message? It does, right? So I get it, it's dumb. It's pretty childish. Like, who the hell sends memes with their corporate email? Well, I do. It's dumb, I get it. A lot of people consider it unprofessional, but in the startup space, and for me personally, I would rather be considered unprofessional than misunderstood. So budgeting, who doesn't like taking care of budgeting, right? I know, I love it too. It's important in a startup space though, because we've got a fixed amount of cash to get to a certain point. And if you haven't worked for a startup before, this may catch you off guard because in a more mature company, you know, there's dedicated teams that handle this, but there's not for us. We've got a fixed amount of cash that we have to get to certain objectives, and if we don't hit those objectives before we run out of money, then there's no way for us to get more money, so it's important. So the first thing to do with that is to identify the credit card infrastructure. And what I mean by that is take a look at your credit card, whether it's your credit card or your CEO's credit card or your CTO's credit card. Go look at all the stuff you signed up for. You've probably got AWS on there, PagerDuty, Splunk, you know, Datadog, all of those services. Some of those you're just going to try out, and then they're not going to work for you. So it's important to shut those down. The ones that do become part of your infrastructure, though, it's important to get them off of that credit card and get that vendor to sending you invoices for it. There's two reasons for that. One, you'll save on the credit card transaction fees. The other, by having them invoice your company for it, it'll go to your finance department. Even if you've only got a finance department of one, it still counts. And so every month the finance team's going to get that bill, and if the bill goes up, they're going to be alerted to it. So now they can start asking questions about, hey, why did this go up? Why are we spending more money on this? But if you leave it on the credit card, they're just going to get a bigger credit card bill every month, and they're not going to know if it's because one of your services increased or because the CEO took the whole team out for 12 rounds of liquid dinner, right? There's no way to know. So get it off the credit card bills. The other thing is understand cost of goods sold. And now cost of goods sold is what does it take to get the product that you're making into the hands of your customer? Let me give you an example for that. Let's say that our tech expenses are $25,000 per month and we have 10,000 monthly users. That means our tech per user is $2.50. And if our business is a monthly subscription fee of $5, that means that 50% of our revenue is going to tech costs. So that doesn't include like employee salaries, office lease space, a marketing budget, or any of the other costs associated with running a business. So we can tell right away that this is not a healthy proposition. You can't spend this much and maintain a healthy business. And the reason to do this early on is because this is a much easier lesson to learn at 10,000 users than at 10 million users, right? All right, the last thing you're going to have to deal with in stage 2 is when to hire. And there's two thoughts on that. There's, you know, as you're growing, you can hire before the growth happens and have your employees trained, or you can wait till the growth happens and then get your employees onboarded at that point. And the key to understanding which is understanding this curve, the S-curve of business growth. So what's going to happen is every business goes through this. And so what you want to do is your temptation to hire is right there on the start. Oh, well, thanks for showing up now. There we go. So the temptation is to hire right here on this start and to hire enough people to meet this growth right here. So what most people aren't aware of, though, because they haven't studied the S-curve of growth, is this plateau right here in the middle, in between those two. So that plateau can represent either your marketing has stalled out and you have to find a new way to reach more customers, or you've reached the scaling efficiency for your architecture as it's currently built, or it can even be things that are completely out of your control, such as economic conditions, such as a recession or a depression. Either way, something is going to happen along that curve that's going to impact your ability to continue to grow. So in a mature, stable business, you know, they typically have cash reserves and they have a diversified product, so they can get through that a little more easily. But we're a startup. We don't have that. We have a fixed amount of cash and some deadlines, and that's it. So whenever anything hits that changes our growth trajectory, it changes our ability to get to that point on the runway where we can get our next round of cash. So whenever you hit this plateau, you only have one option, and that's to reduce expenses. Reducing expenses in startup world typically means cutting your operating costs, and a lot of times that means laying people off, which no one wants to do. So the other way to handle that is to hold your growth until you get up to this point on the curve right here, and then add the people to the processes based on the new demand. When all that goes well, you'll find yourself in stage 3. And so during stage 2, we built the systems, the processes, and the culture for our business. And now in stage 3, we're turning on the lights in the factory, we're putting everything into full-blown production mode, and we're running with it. Much like stage 2, there's no billboard to tell you when you get there, but some of the signs that may indicate that are you have Series C funding, which is used typically for acquisitions, mergers, and partnerships to expand your business. Or it may be a liquidity event such as an IPO to take your company public, or a buyout where the company gets bought outright. From a DevOps perspective, our objectives are to make sure that our tool chain is complete. All of this stuff here should have been built during stage 2, but if you haven't gotten something on here complete yet, now's the time to make it a high priority. For the things that you've already built, you need to go back and sit down with your teams and make sure that it's working for them, and then it's helping them, it's enabling them to become more productive or to be more productive, and readdress any issues that come up. So now, this may be the first time you've seen in this talk like a DevOps EType slide, right? Because we've kind of been in untraditional DevOps territory so far, because through this point in our company, we've been actually building all the individual components that make up the DevOps lifecycle. And it's only at this point now where they're all put together that we can actually put the whole picture together and understand how to implement all this. We've spent a lot of time establishing how we communicate across teams. We spent a lot of time making sure our infrastructure aligns with our financial goals and that we can afford to scale. And now that we're in stage 3, we actually put this DevOps cycle into action. And this is when it starts to look like a company, a more mature company that you may have worked with in the past. Some of the other things you're going to have to implement in stage 3 are you're going to start attracting a different type of employee now. You're going to start attracting employees who are looking for like career patterns or career paths and growth. So they're going to expect things like employee reviews and formalized feedback. They're going to look for things like education and training programs, so they can do something like, I don't know, maybe get a ticket to DevOps Pro Europe, right? They're also going to look for some career advancement opportunities. But the cool thing about this is you don't have to figure out how to do all of this yourself, because at this point in your company, you're going to have an HR department who's going to put all the framework in for you, and then all you have to do is just implement this for your team. So if this were a Disney movie, this would be the part where we stand out on the rock and we watch the sunset over our kingdom, right? And then we have a decision to make, which is decision time. Do we want to update our own personal skills to the skills necessary to run a business for the long run? Or do we want to move on to our next startup? You have to decide what's right for you personally, because some people feel guilt in saying, no, I want to move on to the next startup. But actually, it's an injustice to yourself and to the company to stay in a position that's not right for you, and you're depriving someone else of the ability to step up into that role and take it to the next level. So let's recap the 3 stages real quick. Stage 1, not a lot for us to do here, but when we do get involved, we want to build simple servers, simple databases, automate the things that we can, but the main thing is help guide this young startup to a path of avoiding mistakes that are going to be costly for them. Stage 2, we want to start building our automation tool, building out the DevOps tool chain, and putting in like the culture and the communication steps that are going to allow us to grow. And in stage 3 is when we refine our tools, but we put everything into action and put it into operation. And then we implement like the more mature company features of running a business, such as employee reviews, feedback, career paths. And this is where it starts to really look like a company, like a traditional company. And then you have to choose your own adventure. You have to decide what's right for you. Are you going to stay with this startup and stick with it long run, or are you going to move on and go to the next startup? So the last piece of advice I'll leave you with is this is what's worked for me over the years. Your mileage may vary. Everyone gets it a little different, but I love this quote by Mark Ripto because it just kind of sums up startup life in general. The last thing is if you want to grab these slides, you can go to my website, willbutton.co/3. We're also going to publish them as part of the conference. And then there's, I had to strip so much of this out to get it to fit into this talk. And so if you go to my website, there's also a book that I wrote with all the stuff that I couldn't fit into the talks today. And so yeah, we got a couple minutes left for Q&A, so let's do it.
Great speech indeed. Thank you, Will.